Let me tell you a little bit about Robert North and about why we are very pleased to have him with us today. Dr. North was born in Walton, New York, and received his education at Union College, where he took his degree, his bachelor's degree in language and literature. Then he went to Stanford University, where he received his master's degree and his PhD in international relations and political science, respectively. He has obviously been in the field for many, many years. He received his PhD from Stanford in 1957. So he's been involved in the teaching and in research of international relations and political science for many years. And he has held many positions in research at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's been president of the International Studies Association. And he is also the author of several major works. Most specifically, his book, of which he was the co-author in 1981, The World of the Superpowers. He is a veteran of World War II. He entered his military service at the rank of private and rose to the rank of captain, and has received 7 battle stars. That is a star for each landing in the Pacific theater, and he's very familiar with this concept of island hopping. In talking with Dr. North, the thing that I have been the most pleased with and the most impressed with is that we have with us today someone who has observed and participated in the development of international relations as a discipline as we know it today in the period since World War II. We're very pleased to have him with us. He's going to speak to us for about 30 minutes and then open up the time for questioning. So please welcome to the David M. Kennedy Center, Robert C. North.
Since we have a very large topic and a limited amount of time, I'm going to approach this somewhat selectively and hope we can get something out of it in the time available. I'd like to do it so that we have a reasonable amount of time for questions. So as I go along, I hope you'll be formulating any questions that come to your mind, and maybe we can get the time to discuss at least some of them before we have to close. I decided the best way to try to accomplish a lot in a very limited period of time was to hang the discussion on 2 paradoxes that I see. Paradoxes are dilemmas. If you're in the position where you have to make a decision, a paradox becomes a dilemma. I'm going to call them paradoxes, but you can just look at them as dilemmas if you want to. The one first paradox, main paradox, I call the paradox of security, and then the corollary I call the paradox of peace. And I think that these 2 paradoxes explain why it's so difficult to find any reliable alternative to war. I think if these were not paradoxes, we'd be able to regulate our lives much more successfully. But almost by definition, a paradox is a situation in which there's no clear alternative. The paradox of security goes something like this, that any society, and I think it's sort of true of individuals, but right now we're talking about societies and nations, any nation, in an effort to secure to obtain, to achieve, and maintain some measure of economic, political, and military or strategic security for the society as a whole and its members, is likely to undertake actions, policies, and actions which will be perceived by some other society as threatening to its economic, political, or strategic security. Now, this means, in practical terms, that one way of looking at the East-West conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, is precisely in these terms, that each side is taking measures day in and day out, year in and year out, to optimize, at least, its economic, political, and strategic security with measures which at least one other country is likely to perceive as a threat to its own economic, political, and strategic security. And if you stop to think of it, in the world as it is, that means that when we undertake these measures, we're doing it for our country, the United States, and the whole idea of patriotism is built around these concepts. But the people in the Soviet Union are doing the same thing. And where each side is taking the historically established measures to maintain their respective securities. Now, the more you turn that around in your mind, the more you begin to feel what a terrible position this is. And yet, it's the central reality of the whole international system, and it dates back in history to the emergence of the first state some millennia ago. Now, there are many complications to this situation. It would be complicated enough if all states had the same capabilities. But this obviously is not true, because societies have differential capabilities, differential rates of growth and development. And one way of getting a handle on this very complex kind of reality is that there seem to be, in my mind, three main variables, three master variables, which help to account for the uneven growth of societies in the world. One is population, the numbers of people. Just in order to keep ourselves alive, every human being has some minimal amount of food, water, air, living space that he or she must have just to stay alive. And this is an ironclad law, if you will. There are not many ironclad laws in human affairs. Most laws are not really laws. They're just tendencies. But this is absolute, because if we don't have air, we die in a matter of minutes. If we don't have food, we can live for some days, but eventually we'll die, and so forth. So we start with what this minimum basic necessities of the individual human being, and then we multiply it by the total population of the world, and you'll see what the demands for these basic resources amount to within the whole global system. And as the population grows, demand grows with it. So just population growth puts exponentially increasing demands on the natural environment with all sorts of consequences which we're becoming increasingly aware of. Now, what do we do in order to try to obtain the resources that are needed to support ourselves? Well, we turn to what I call technology. But when I say technology, I mean knowledge and skills. I don't mean machines. Machines are just tools to serve our knowledge and skills. And technology defined in this way is as old as the human species. It goes back deep into prehistoric times. But technology also has developed exponentially, so that we have population expanding exponentially and we have technology advancing exponentially. And characteristic of exponential growth is a shortening of the doubling time, so that in terms of population from the time of Christ until 1650, one doubling of the human population occurred. But today the doubling time, with some between 4 and 5 billion people in the world, the doubling time now is 30 years. So it's changed from 1,600 years doubling time to 30 years in the last 2,000 years. So the same kind of mathematics is taking place in terms of our technology. Technology allows us to obtain new resources, and technology also enables us to find new uses for old resources, new uses for resources that are perhaps more available. And this is what a large part of our development depends upon. But there's one catch-22 which is often overlooked, and that is that the application of technology, every application of technology, also requires resources. It requires some kind of fuel or motive power, whether it's wood or coal or nuclear or whatever it is. And it requires materials for construction of plants and factories and things like that, transportation, and machines for the transformation of raw materials into useful products, and then the resources required in order to distribute the resources. So that the development of technology doesn't in any way solve our resource problem. It has a double effect. It increases our capabilities, but the resources required increase exponentially. So that even to build one automobile, for example, takes a tremendous array and amount of resources from all parts of the world. And when we come to a computer, it's much more complicated, and so it goes. So you begin to get a picture of the dynamics of the world we live in, and how the dynamics have been speeding up in historical times. And so every day we live is, in a sense, unprecedented in terms of both the power of the dynamics and the problems associated with the dynamics. So we're on a high-speed track. Every day is the day of our lives, and we're accelerating. Now, one of the major outcomes of our technological development, much of which has been life-sustaining, notably in the health field, for example, people are living longer, and we're dealing with diseases which once we couldn't do very much about, so forth. So there are all those positive sides. But technology is essentially value neutral. And how we use our technology depends on us. It's a human decision. Technology itself does not invoke values. We invoke the values. So it means that almost any invention we make can be used for good purposes or it can be used for bad purposes. And what is dominating our lives today is the consideration that as human beings we've developed weapons which are now massively destructive. Weapons which now have the potential of wiping us all out, certainly destroying our civilization. So they're potentially counterproductive. And whereas in the past, when we had less powerful weapons, we could use them very selectively, and although a lot of people were killed and many terrible things were perpetrated, nevertheless they were more or less localized. But with modern weapons, we've reached through a threshold where we have the possibility of destroying everything we're trying to save, which is conceptually, ethically, practically unprecedented in human affairs. And it's difficult to see that we have the wisdom to know how to handle a situation like this. And this leads now directly into the corollary of my first paradox, the paradox of security. The paradox of peace is that when two nations, as a consequence of the security paradox, have gotten themselves into a crisis or a war, an arms race, a crisis, a war, if either country, for whatever reason, wants to make peace, takes a conciliatory move, an effort, a peacemaking move, a peace-prone move, the probabilities are reasonably high that the adversary, will interpret the conciliatory move either as a deception. He's up to no good, he's going to pull a trick on me, or as a sign of weakness to be exploited. Now we have lots of historical examples of both of these. The one where during World War I, early in World War I, at one point before the fighting actually began and the troops were being moved around and the navies were moving around, the French government, and really none of the countries really wanted to get into a war at that particular time. The French government decided on a conciliatory move, and they withdrew some of their troops from close to the German border as a signal that they would be willing to negotiate further. And the Germans interpreted that as a deception. And they were sure that when the French withdrew their troops on this front, they were planning to attack on some other front. So that's an example of a perception of deception. It wasn't, in fact, intended as a deception, but it was perceived by the adversary as being a deception. The other perception of a conciliatory move as a sign of weakness to be exploited would be the appeasement, what's called the Chamberlain appeasement of Hitler prior to World War II. this was a genuine effort on the part of the British to try to negotiate rather than to fight. And if it had worked, Chamberlain would have gone down in history as a great statesman and peacemaker. But Hitler interpreted it as a sign of weakness and determined right then and there to take advantage of it, which he did. I see this is a terrible dilemma which often people who believe in peace and work for peace don't take account of, or if they take account of, it inhibits them from effective consequence. I speak very personally about this because when I was an undergraduate, I belonged to a peace group, and I considered myself a pacifist. I believed as deeply as I've ever believed in anything, I think, at that period. But it happened that I was in Europe, particularly in 1938, just at the time when Hitler undertook the Anschluss, the union with Austria, which he did simply by moving his troops across the border. And I was in Rome about 3-4 weeks later, just at the time when Hitler came down to confer with Mussolini. I saw them, I was as close to both of them that I could have hit either one with a pea shooter. And I heard them speak, and I saw their military parades, and I saw the SS operating in Italy. Hitler had brought SS units with him, and they began right in the, and I saw with my own eyes them undertaking the first anti-Jewish activities in Italy by the German SS. I had tea and later breakfast with a man who, we were sitting at the little cafe having breakfast, and 2 SS officers came and sat down. And this man was a Jewish professor, and he didn't take the time to say goodbye. He just ducked under the table and down among the bushes, trying to get away. He was never seen again by his friends or family. He disappeared completely. Nobody knows what happened to him. That kind of thing was going on throughout the city of Rome during Hitler's visit. And from Rome I went back through Austria and through Germany, and by the time I got to Belgium, I was so, I just couldn't get there fast enough. So when I came back home after that, I was already caught in the security dilemma. And from then on, throughout World War II and down to the present time, I've never been able to get myself out of the security dilemma. And this is a very sobering consideration. And the whole future of the human species, I think, depends on whether or not we ever have a capacity as human beings for somehow or other moving beyond the security paradox. And it's easy to understand why peace movements never really appear to achieve any reliable constraint on the outbreak of war. And when we speak of a paradox, the assumption is by people who study paradoxes, and some very interesting work that's been done in the last few decades on paradoxes of all kinds and how you override a paradox. And the general conclusion by the people who make that kind of study is that it takes the achievement of a higher level of consciousness, a higher understanding of human affairs and human potentials. It's not something you can just will. It comes about by some period of conceptual and perceptual and I guess intellectual and moral insight that presumably comes through some adaptive processes, and it's not anything that's likely to take place in a flash. Well, we're talking about billions of people now, that a large proportion of which would have to achieve some such level of consciousness if we were ever to get ourselves out of the either of the two paradoxes, which is kind of a melancholy place to end. But I think maybe we've reached the point now where the most productive thing we can do with the rest of the time that's available to us is just to open this to any questions you may have and any discussion. Yes.
Well, I guess a good place to start. The question, of course, that comes to my mind as you talk about this is what you see as the future between the U.S. and the USSR now with the relations between Gorbachev and Reagan.
Yeah.
That's a common question. I'd like to know where that comes from.
Well, I think that's right at the center of things. Yeah, I think that the criterion for any kind of success with this second paradox requires adversaries to find ways of dealing with each other. We won't, for these purposes, we won't discuss our friends. That's not the issue. The issue is whether we can deal with our enemies. I see that human experience, by and large, teaches us to distrust our enemies and hate them. And this becomes almost a controlling element of the peace paradox. The reason, because it works on both sides. That is, in order for the peace paradox to be transcended, it's not enough that one adversary sees the light. Both have to see the light. And that's the trick. So I think that what's happened in recent months between the United States and the Soviet Union is maybe the first really hopeful sign I've seen since the Cold War began. And so I think we're in the middle of an opportunity right now that I haven't seen since the Cold War began. The Cold War began really almost before World War II was over. It surfaced certainly very soon after World War II, but I think the seeds were all planted in the latter stages of World War II. So we are in an historic moment now. But it's a very fragile moment. And if a false move on either side could destroy the moment. Whether it was intentional or unintentional, it could still destroy the moment. Yes?
Because it's a great opportunity and a historical moment. What do you see as the chances of this continuing? What are the real chances of it breaking down as a paradox if we start
Yeah. I think about that a lot, especially at night. I don't know how a statistician, for example, would put a probability number on that. When I'm thinking soberly about it, I think the probabilities are not very high. And that's a dreadful thing to say, and I don't want to believe it. But I have another feeling about it. I feel that since there's no way of knowing, it's impossible to put a number on it. The only sane way to proceed is to proceed as though there is a probability, a reasonable probability. Now this raises a point that I made yesterday. In fact, I think I almost started off with it yesterday because I think it's the most important consideration maybe of all. But I had a little more time yesterday, so I could go at it more slowly. The state doesn't decide anything. There's no such. The state doesn't think. The state doesn't feel. The state doesn't act. All actions, all thinking, all perceiving, all feeling, all action is generated by us as individuals. Right up here, wherever it is. So the only place it can start is with us. Not only us sitting here, but really us all over the world. So there have got to be some Russians thinking in similar lines. And Arabs, Israelis, everybody. Pakistanis, Indians, wherever we want to go, Iraqis, Iranians. But there's more to that problem. There's always a further catch. The people, the peacemakers, it isn't enough that would-be peacemakers proceed this way. Everybody has to be brought along. I mean, one Hitler in the world can destroy the whole thing, provided he can get a following. And it's almost inherent a notion of a Hitler that he has the capabilities of attracting a following. So a part of the problem is to create environments where if a Hitler arrives, if a potential Hitler arrives, people won't follow him. And this is a very large order. And these are all considerations that would have to go into any attempt to calculate the probabilities. And in a way, it's useless to think about it in terms of the probabilities. The only thing to do is to proceed on some kind of informed faith and possible outcome on this. Yes.
In light of the recent dialogue between the East and the West, with the up-and-coming elections, what type of national leader do you think can best perpetuate that dialogue? Perhaps a strong, more conservative candidate, or a candidate who's more inclined to reduce the defense and those types of things? What type of candidate can do that?
Well, that's a very difficult kind of decision to reach. I have my own personal predilections, but I've discovered over the years that I can't trust them altogether. See, my first reaction would be to put in a man of compassion who would really understand this. But then I have to remind myself that for many years, in fact, all of my early years as a scholar were devoted very much to the relations with Soviet Union and China. And it's hard to remember now that there was a time in the 50s when particularly the more conservative groups in this country thought that China was our worst enemy. And conservative people in the 50s tended to say, we'll never be able to talk with China, we'll never be able to deal with the Chinese. And it was a very strong political movement on the sort of neoconservative right, pushing that idea in government. So this, at the time, tended to persuade me that only by strengthening the liberal side of the spectrum could we possibly recognize China. Now, what actually happened? What happened was that the liberal Democrats, for example, could never do it. They couldn't. You couldn't. A liberal would be impeached if he pushed too hard for recognizing China in the 1950s, because he'd be soft on communism, you see. So who opened China? Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon rose in the conservative movement on his anti-Chinese policy. When he was running for the Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas in California, Helen Gahagan Douglas wanted to recognize China. I sat on a platform with her when she was first beginning to campaign, where she made, I thought, a reasonable, rational, but compelling, emotionally compelling argument for recognizing China. Well, she lost to Richard Nixon, who precisely on that issue, and he was dumping all over her for being soft on communism. But the consequence was that after he got into office as president, I don't know what changed his mind. I guess it was dealing with the situation changed his mind. Well, he was better equipped to go to China because nobody could accuse him of being soft on communism. So what did he do? We went to Peking, and we've been dealing with the Chinese ever since. Now that seems like a kind of a paradox in itself. And I never would have foreseen that. This is what I see retrospectively. Now what I make out of this is that the compassionate people, if we can, that's a loaded word in a way, but the people who start off wanting peace, it's in their nature, they want peace. And if they were to run for president, they'd run on a platform of peace and not get elected. They have to work in spheres where they can work effectively. And somehow or other they have to create the situation where a less compassionate man sees that this is the only practical way to go. In other words, the doves need to prepare the way for the hawks, because it'll never happen until the hawks are ready to let it happen. And I'm not talking about one side, I'm talking about both sides, because there are hawks and doves in every society. And for a long time, the hawks have been sitting in Moscow, and off and on, the hawks sit in Washington. Most people who get to be, well, when you get to be president, what do? you take the responsibility for maintaining the military establishment and using it when you have to. And you swear on the Bible to do that. So the chances of a real dove becoming a president are just about nil. So I'm taking what I think is a holistic view here. I'm trying to say that we're always going to have hawks and doves, and the doves are constrained in certain ways, the hawks are constrained in other ways, and it's only when the two get together behind a program that it's going to have any possibility of working. Any other questions?
Would you clarify your statement, please, for me on why the weaponry of today has become almost counterproductive?
Yeah, because if we... I don't remember now how many nuclear weapons we have, but we would only have to use a small proportion of those to destroy all of our productive, all of our cities of the world, all of our productive capability. Probably a large part of the croplands of the world would not produce crops anymore for a long time. So I am not suggesting that maybe every human being is going to be extinguished by war. I don't think that's probable. But I think it's probable that it would set the whole of humanity back so far that it would be centuries before we could reconstruct ourselves. And the casualties would be enormous. Would be enormous. When you think of how many times more powerful our weapons are now than were the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which wiped out a lot of people. But it was infinitesimal compared with what we could do with a full-scale nuclear war today. So that's what I mean. And there's another counterproductive aspect. You see, the state has always relied on force, organized force, as the ultimate sanction for domestic peace and external security. When the normal police function breaks down in a society, what happens? They call out the army. They establish martial law. Any society does. That's the ultimate for domestic peace, and it's the norm for an external threat. That's the only way the state works. That's why the state emerged, because the state emerged to create those conditions. We don't know any real alternative to this. So our whole history teaches us that ultimately, wherever necessary, we rely on force. But this was always localized in the past. The whole world was never at the same time the potential target of destruction. And that's what it is now. If there are enough nuclear weapons in the world, which, if all targeted, could just reduce everything to utter ruin. Yes?
In the paradox of security peace, would you think that it is more important to change policy maybe with those nations that can understand this paradox? Maybe like the Soviet Union, maybe they have a leader right now that is more understanding of it, as compared to like the Middle East, where we have favorable relations with Israel, but yet that area is much more explosive, and maybe they don't understand this paradox as much.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that situation?
Well, I think you've put your finger on a very important issue, which I didn't raise here. It seemed to me, even during the darkest days of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, again, to talk in probabilities which we can't put any numbers on, it seemed to me that even in the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis when we came awfully close to a nuclear interchange. I thought, maybe not at the moment of the crisis, but before the crisis and after, retrospectively after the crisis, I thought that the probabilities of a war breaking out because of a direct interchange, nuclear interchange between the United States and the Soviet Union was probably fairly low. Because I think that whether we agreed with the Russians on anything else or not, I don't think there's been a Russian leader who was prepared to deliberately enter into a nuclear interchange with the United States because he was smart enough to see what it might lead to. And I think the same thing could be said for our side in this. We had an understanding. What became more dangerous as time went on was that when we were heavily dependent on radar and things like that for early warning, which wasn't really very early, there was always a possibility that either side might perceive through some signal, false signal, that the other side either had already launched or was about to launch, in which the other side would preempt. And either side might do that. Where you have to decide within 5 minutes whether you're under attack or not, which is about 5 to 7 minutes is the time you've got to make up your mind whether you're really in danger or not. That enhances the probability that one side or the other who perceives that is going to act on it. So that was that real danger. But in general, I thought the greater danger was that some other country which had maybe developed one weapon, a high conflict, the kind of conflict you're talking about, long-standing and bitter and frustrating conflict that neither side could ever resolve. And suddenly one side gets a nuclear weapon or two and fires them. And it's fired by one client state on one side, a U.S. client or a Russian client. And once it's fired, it wouldn't matter which client fired it. The other side would then come in on the side of the target client and fire at the other major power. That kind of thing, an escalation, which is pretty much the way World War I started. It started with an assassination in the Balkans. Had nothing to do, really, with either Germany or England. It was an Austro-Hungarian problem. But the Austro-Hungarians, it was a Serbian who perpetrated the assassination. So then the Austrians decided to punish Serbia. So then Russia decided to support Serbia. Then Germany supported Austria-Hungary, and then Britain and France supported the Serbs, in effect. So the thing just spiraled like that.
That'll have to be the last question. Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to announce that next Monday in this room from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, we will have an address by Rabbi David Rosen, who will be speaking on the subject of contemporary politics in Israel. And we invite you to be with us at that time. Thank you. Thank you.